Well, hello, everyone. My name is Don Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. This is my good friend, Michael Sullivan, here on my left or your right or whatever that might happen to be from North Carolina. Michael and I go back a lot of years. In fact, I was talking to somebody about it just the other day that, boy, we go a long way back.
Yes.
So anyway, as an awful lot of you know, if you don't already, just recently, there was a blog program that had Sam Frost, former preterist, on the program with the express aim to try to refute preterism, full preterism. It was a 2.5 hour blog. This program will not go that long, but nonetheless, it was in many ways, and I'm not trying to be overly critical, but it was kind of a rambling discussion of an awful lot of issues. And I've had, Mike, I don't know about you, but I've had an awful lot of people contact me and say they had a tough time keeping up with the discussion, and that it was just there was a lot of almost incoherence to it. There was no, well, I mean, you don't have to be organized in order to have a blog. You could have just an informal discussion. That's fine. That's good. We're going to do some of that right here on this blog. But an awful lot of people really express disappointment in that. And somebody might say, well, they're just full preterists. Well, a lot of the people who express that disappointment on the blog comments don't even have their mind made up.
Right.
And so they were still disappointed. Well,
Right.
we hope you're not disappointed in what we're going to do. So with that said, all right, let's get right into it. One of the very first things, Michael, that I think we need to cover are two issues that are not exegetical. They are not, quote, biblical arguments that were offered. To use the old term, they're strictly ad hominem. There are an awful lot of other terms that a person could use for them. They're poisoning the well arguments. I would call them argumentum ad desperatum type of arguments. They really prove absolutely nothing. But apart from that, I found them, and some others did as well, I found them particularly distressing because they're simply not true.
Right.
They are grossly misrepresentative. They are grossly inaccurate. We'll take them one by one. Point number one, Sam Frost said repeatedly, and with emphasis at one point, that he believes that although there are some good, honest people in the preterist movement, that the preterist movement is in fact cultic. Well, obviously, you know, the word cult is a buzzword. It's a fear-mongering word. You have people out there going, oh my goodness, full preterism, it's a cult. I better stay away from that. So, Michael, why don't you give us your initial response, and then I'll chime in with some other issues.
Sure. Well, I made a list of them. If you study full preterism or become a full preterist, you're Gnostic. You have to deny God's omniscience. You have to embrace universalism.
Mm-hmm.
You employ a dispensational hermeneutic somehow, even though we're the antithesis of dispensationalism. And you are an idolater.
Yes.
Because we worship, AD 70 and the fall of Jerusalem and not Christ,
right,
apparently. So this makes us a cult. And then of course later on we will get into Hymenaeus and Philetus, but that's kind of the big go-to, which I find interesting that Keith Matheson wouldn't even use that text to refute us, because he knows that there was a spiritual AD 70 coming and a spiritual AD 70 resurrection.
Correct.
So he knows he couldn't. So I found all of that just, and we talked about this, Don, you're an Arminian, I'm a Calvinist. So when I hear critics on your side of the fence, so to speak, they're always claiming, well, if you guys believe this full preterism, you have to be a Calvinist.
Yep.
So now we have Jeremiah trying to scare his audience by saying, oh, don't study this because it comes from the Church of Christ.
Right.
Don't study this because you'll have to be an open theist,
right,
or an Arminian, or a Universalist. No, those are all buzzwords.
Yeah.
And the Reformed community is just going, oh,
right.
right. I can't study this. So like you said, it's poisoning the well.
Exactly. Well, and let me point something out from the world of scholarship when it comes to the issue of cultism. And Walter Martin, way back in the 80s, 1980s, pointed this out. Now, he was certainly not the definitive source or definition of a cult, but others who have studied cults point out that there are certain characteristics of what a cult, what comprises and identifies a cult. And I'll just give these ever so briefly because we got a lot of territory to cover. Point number one, a cult is identified by one central, dominating, authoritative figure whose proclamations are absolutely unquestionable. And when people have said, "Oh, preterism, nothing but a cult," I said, "Oh, really? Who's the unquestionable authority figure in preterism?"
Don, does that mean we have to cancel the compound that we were going to build around your house?
I guess it does.
Okay.
Yeah, But look, this is the number one characteristic of a cult. You have one singular. Well, in a few instances, historically you may have had, a triumvirate or whatever. But the point of it is, you have one singular, authoritative, unquestioned and unquestionable authority figure. Now, that primary authoritative figure determines all doctrine with no variation allowed. Well, let's see. You're a Calvinist. I'm an Arminian. Well, I don't even like the term, but we'll use the term. So anyway, in a cult, the leader, whoever that might be, would say, "Okay, Preston, get in line, because I'm not going to allow any questions. I'm not going to allow any divergent. I'm not going to allow any investigation beyond anything that I say." That's just the way it is. Point number three, a cult leader controls all finances of the movement of which he is the unquestioned head. And I've said, wow, man, I'm doing something wrong.
Me too. Me too. This is a labor of love.
This is a labor of love and has been for many years.
Right.
And point number four, that leader, that authoritative leader, controls all social life of all of the members, including, if you're single, they control who you date. If you're married, and many cults, true cults, like Jeffrey cult out in Utah some years ago, he even controlled when and how married couples could engage in conjugal relations. Now, folks, that's a cult. Okay. Right. And so when Sam Frost just flippantly and repeatedly throws out that designation, well, there may be some good, honest people, sincere people in preterism, but really it's actually just a cult. Now, I dare say that Sam Frost knows better than that from a scholarly perspective. If he doesn't, then he needs to do some study. And Amen. I mean, I just say that very bluntly. So don't tell me, for instance, don't tell me you're a scholar that knows all about cults, and then you make an accusation against people who absolutely not in any of the 5 leading points that cult researchers have identified down through the years. They say these are what identify a cult. If you cannot point to preterism and say, oh, an unquestioned authoritative figure who makes all doctrinal decisions, makes all financial decisions, and on it goes. If you can't prove that preterism matches that, then really honestly, with all bluntness, but kindness and respect, you really ought to stop throwing around the label of a cult.
Yeah,
Because
but Don, let me interject for just
yeah,
a second.
yeah,
But notice in the podcast that Sam Frost, because he's educated, he was educated. He was a full preterist scholar, probably the only one in the movement, apparently, according to him. He was able, with his vast intelligence and scholarship, to get himself out of this cult.
Yeah.
But us poor uneducated folk, we're still stuck in it.
Well, that's certainly what was communicated. Other people have expressed that,
Yeah.
and that's an unfortunate attitude to have. But again, to me, the really the main thrust is to make that kind of an accusation, which flies in the face of all scholarly study of what identifies and characterizes a genuine cult, and not one of the points matches preterism. It's really irresponsible, and I would urge Jeremiah. I really would. I'd urge Jeremiah. Maybe if he's not aware of these characteristics, maybe he needs to do some research. Maybe he needs to approach Sam Frost. Sam Frost perhaps needs to look a little bit closer at the scholarly literature on what identifies as a cult. And maybe, just maybe, Sam Frost needs to back off and to issue an apology to the entire preterist community to say, I apologize. Preterism is not a cult. It doesn't fit the description that scholars who have actually studied the issue identify as a cult.
Yeah.
So I would urge our viewers to think seriously about this. Why would a man who should, and I emphasize should, I mean, look, we've all got our blind spots. We've all got our ignorant spots. Not everybody knows what the scholarly literature is on a cult. Okay, I understand that. So I don't want to be unfair in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But if you're going to throw the label around, then you really ought to know what you're talking about. And pretty clearly, Mr. Sam Frost made a false accusation. The second point, and you had a great list there. I mean, and of course I had the same list basically, but the second item that I really want to touch on, and we'll probably hit a lot of the others as we go along, but the other one was, well, this is Gnosticism. Preterism is Gnosticism because they deny the physical body redemption and et cetera, et cetera. And I found a lot of what was said kind of confusing, to be honest about it. I tried to follow it. I would back it up. I would listen to it again. I would go, I'm just not sure I catch that. But let's address the issue of Gnosticism. Michael, when a person studies Gnosticism, what is the fundamental belief? I mean, the fundamental belief of Gnosticism.
Well, the physical creation and the physical body is evil.
Exactly.
We do not believe that.
Correct.
We've never believed that. In fact, in Philippians 3, if you take the vile body there as the physical body, you have a problem.
You have a real problem.
And I think you at one time had cited a scholar that was reading the Apostle Paul in Romans and said, Paul, the Gnostic, or the book of Hebrews, going from physical to spiritual. Jesus talks about his kingdom when he comes from heaven. Luke 17, the kingdom of God will be within you. You're not going to be able to see it. Daniel 2, the kingdom is spiritual. None of this is Gnosticism. It's pure Bible 101.
Excellent comments. And yes, matter of fact, in the 19th century, there were actually a group of scholars. Of course, they belonged to a very liberal mindset, but nonetheless, when they read Paul, and it was especially in Romans 7 and 8, when they read Paul, you have Paul saying, those who are in the flesh cannot be pleasing to God. Heavens, okay. That's pure Gnosticism. Paul has a really negative view of the physical body. Oh, I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwells no good thing. Paul hates the flesh. Oh, wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death? That's his physical body. Paul hated his physical body. So when these scholars approach, and of course, again, this group of scholars, 19th century, at that particular point in scholarship, it was widely believed that Gnosticism was a major problem in the early church. They believed that First John was written, for instance, to address Gnosticism. Well, now scholarship has moved away from that. And if anyone wants to read an amazing book on this issue, I would suggest that you get Carl Smith, who is a noted scholar, highly respected. His book is No Longer Jews. Well, folks, here's the interesting thing about, there you go.
Tom Holland.
Tom
Holland as well.
Oh, yeah. Tom Holland's work is great. But anyway, Carl Smith, in his book, No Longer Jews, says that Gnosticism did not arise until the 2nd century. Now, in the blog, Sam Frost tried to say, and he said several times, well, you know, all of these Gnostic ideas were floating around prior to the 2nd century. He really danced around the fact that is now widely accepted by most scholarship. Gnosticism did not arise until the 2nd century. Now, if you want to say, well, there were some proto-Gnostic concepts flying around, who in the scholarly world, I'm not aware of anybody that would even deny that particular aspect, but to suggest that it was, quote, Gnosticism is now widely respected. N.T. Wright now, rejects that view. And on this could go. Here's the fascinating thing about Carl Smith. In that book, he says that Gnosticism arose in the 2nd century. It arose not in Judea at all. It arose in Egypt. And thirdly, here's the kicker, folks. It arose among Jews who were disappointed that their eschatological hopes had not been fulfilled at the time they knew it was supposed to be fulfilled. You know, now Carl Smith doesn't point specifically to AD 70, but you get the drift. So here are Jews who knew that the time of the Lord's coming, kingdom, judgment, resurrection, etc., was all supposed to be in the 1st century. They knew the time was right.
Mm-hmm. I would add that during the the period between the testaments, the Second Temple literature, there were Jewish views of a spiritual resurrection.
Oh, no doubt.
Either coming out of Hades, being raised out of Hades, the dead ones, into God's presence, or to be judged, or a spiritual resurrection at death. The soul leaving the body was a spiritual resurrection. So, and the Jews believed that by the time Messiah would show up, there would be 40 years before that resurrection.
That's right.
At the end of the Old Covenant age. Sounds kind of familiar to me, Don.
Sounds kind of familiar. Well, and what's interesting to me about this is we very often run into people who make the argument, like Sam Frost, for instance, who says, well, the Jews believed in physical resurrection. Okay, some of them did, but not all of them. As a matter of fact,
exactly.
There is a really wide range. And by the way, if anyone wishes to have some scholarly documentation on this, even men such as the noted Hebrew scholar, Old Testament scholar, John Collins, points out it's widely claimed this and widely claimed that about the Jews believing in a physical resurrection. But he said the point of fact is that's simply not true on a wide scale basis. And John Collins even says in his commentary on the book of Daniel, the concept that the Jews believed in a physical bodily resurrection is simply not as well attested as many people like to think that it is. Now, look, you can say, well, he's a liberal. Okay, that's fine. He's also a world-class scholar who is intimately familiar with all of that intertestamental period of literature that you were alluding to there a moment ago and just couldn't spit it out. But, you know, there again, men such as Nichols, Berger, Oh my goodness, I just went blank on a whole. I've got a whole list of scholars. And by the way, in my book, Paul on Trial, Paul, the Pharisees, and the Resurrection, I document from some of the finest scholars in the world, both conservative and quote liberal, who openly say the concept that there was a unified belief in a physical resurrection of the physical body out of the dirt among the Jews in the first century is simply misguided.
I reference that in my book too. Yeah, because that's what we always get. The Jews, all
Yeah.
the Pharisees,
Yeah.
they all believed in the physical resurrection. Therefore, well, wait a second, we're going to back you up.
Yeah.
That's not true.
That is absolutely not true. And furthermore, in fact, N.T. Wright makes this comment, and we'll need to come back to this Gnostic thing because I want to touch on it a little bit more. But N.T. Wright makes the comment from the very beginning, among the Pharisees, resurrection was a revolutionary idea. What does he mean by that? Well, if I understand him correctly, and I've read it 2 or 3 different times, I think I've got it right. Maybe I don't. I'm open to correction. But what N.T. Wright is saying, the Pharisees believe. Now, folks, if you want to speak about a widespread Jewish belief, here's one for you. N.T. Wright documents it very, very well. A widespread belief among the Jews was that the kingdom would arrive when Messiah arose and whipped the Romans, restored the people to the land, restored the temple, restored the priesthood, restored pure sacrifices in the temple. I was having a conversation on Facebook not long ago, and this one individual who is rabidly anti-preterist, he said, it's clear the Jews believed in physical resurrection. If the Jews believed in it, we've got to believe in it. I'm going, well, okay, let's follow the line of thought that you're arguing. The Jews believed, let me grant your argument, just for argument's sake here, the Jews believed in physical resurrection. But guess what? The Pharisees, and this is the point N.T. Wright is making, the Pharisees linked their belief of a physical resurrection to the physical nationalistic restoration of Israel.
And the land.
And the land, and the temple, and the priesthood, and the sacrifices. So I asked this fella, upon what basis do you accept the Pharisaic view of physical resurrection, but you sever it from what the Pharisees linked it to, restoration to the land, the city, the temple, the priesthood, et cetera, et cetera? He disappeared from the conversation.
Yeah.
And I don't blame him.
Right.
So when Sam Frost alludes to 2 Timothy chapter 2 in the blog and tries to use it against preterists, well, number one, he admitted, I don't know, I'm sure you caught it, probably made notes on it. Did you note that he admitted that Paul taught and that Hymenaeus and Philetus taught a spiritual resurrection?
Yeah, and he never really addressed why Paul only was dealing with the time issue and didn't just say, well, hey guys, just look around.
Right.
He never addressed that. And I mean, I'm more than willing to get into that whenever you want to, because
well, I mean, it's a critical point, and Sam tries to just dismiss that. I noticed that Jeremiah did not jump into the fray and really grab hold of that text. You know, I don't think anybody really wants to deal with that text. You know, Sam some years ago tried to say, well, it's obvious that Hymenaeus and Philetus were just perverting Paul's doctrine of the resurrection. Well, if you're going to make the claim, then give us the proof. Don't just say they perverted it. What we do know is this: they perverted the time. And as you just pointed out, that's what Paul corrected. And that's what Sam admitted on the blog. That's what Paul corrected. Paul did not correct any concept of the nature of the resurrection. Now, folks, ask yourself the question. If Paul was teaching physical resurrection, and if Hymenaeus was teaching physical resurrection, if Hymenaeus and Paul were on the same page in regard to the nature of the resurrection, then it would make perfect sense for Paul to correct only the timing. that Hymenaeus and Philetus were misconstruing. So if you got agreement as to the nature, but you're just disagreeing on the timing, then what happened with Paul and Hymenaeus fits perfectly well. If, however, Paul's teaching one doctrine of the resurrection as to the different in nature, and Hymenaeus is teaching a radically different resurrection, different in nature, then why did Paul even bother with the time?
Exactly.
The timing element is irrelevant, really.
Yeah.
All you have to do is deal with the nature, and you've dealt with the time. But as Sam admitted on the program the other night, Paul didn't correct their concept of the nature. He corrected their time. That's the only thing that he corrected.
So Keith Matheson, in this book here, Postmillennialism and Eschatology of Hope, in here in Thessalonians, he talks about those that were teaching that the day of the Lord had already been fulfilled. And he uses our argument, right? He says, well, this was clearly a spiritual coming of the Lord in AD 70, or Paul would have just said, he would have reduced his argument down to one sentence. Are you still here?
Right.
Okay, now, why can't we then go to Timothy and say the same thing?
Yeah.
It's the same exact argument from silence that Paul is using in both. He's correcting the timing because he agrees with a spiritual fulfillment, both of the day of the Lord and of the resurrection.
I just want to make one real comment, real quick comment, and then I want to get back to the Gnostic issue because it's so important, I think. You pointed out ever so correctly, the basic fundamental doctrine of Gnosticism was the physical body is inherently, intrinsically evil and wicked. Ladies and gentlemen, please catch the power of what I'm about to say. Preterists do not believe that. Now, if the fundamental, primary, starting point A of Gnosticism is the body is wicked, it's cursed, it's evil. If that's the starting point, then if you're going to point the finger at Don Preston and you're going to say Don Preston is a Gnostic, then please demonstrate from my writing anywhere, you can't do it, that Don Preston has ever said, ever implied, ever suggested the human physical body is cursed, evil, and wicked.
Right.
No.
Well, they try. Sam tries to get away with this by saying Gnostic tendencies or neo-Gnosticism.
I didn't even hear those terms the other night. Maybe I missed those terms. I just heard the term Gnostic. So let's go back. Let's go back to Paul in Romans. Now, keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, we touched on it, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. Keep in mind that Paul says, those who are in the flesh cannot be pleasing to God. Now, listen, ladies and gentlemen, if Paul were teaching genuine Gnosticism, and if Preston and Sullivan were teaching true Gnosticism, we would say, you know what? Until we lay off this physical body, we cannot be pleasing to God. They just simply know it. I mean, it's what Paul said. Those who are in the flesh cannot be pleasing to God. Well, listen, years ago, Sam Frost did some writing on the book of Romans. He knows that in Romans chapter 8 and 7 and 8, he knows that Paul wasn't speaking of the biological flesh when he said those are in the flesh cannot be pleasing to God.
But it actually goes back to Romans 5 and 6, the body
sure.
of sin, the mortal body, the body of death, the body of flesh, as he uses them elsewhere in Colossians and Ephesians. And as you know, Tom Holland deals with these terms and says, and cites other scholars and says, whoa, this is not referring to this.
That's right.
It's either the sinful mode of existence or it's a corporate body. Yep. And it's got nothing to do with that. Now, I guess Tom Holland and the scholarship there is going Gnostic.
Well, and again, this gets back to poisoning the well, which is so troubling.
Right.
You know, why do you spend so much time telling your audience you've got to beware of all these preterists because they're cultic and because they're Gnostic, when in fact, we are not Gnostic. Sam Frost knows that, for instance, when you come to 1 Corinthians 15, Paul uses a couple of words, pneumatikos and psychikos. Well, guess what? And by the way, this was really, really enlightening. In his book entitled Why Not Full Preterisms, which Steve Gregg recently published, and I'll be reviewing that and responding to that on my YouTube videos very, very shortly. But nonetheless, Steve Gregg shifts back and forth, and he says, well, you know, psychikos is not referring to biologic flesh. It's a life lived in contradiction to God. And I'm going, well, hallelujah. we're making progress here.
Oh, he's going Gnostic. He has
He's going
Gnostic
Gnostic.
tendencies.
Absolutely going Gnostic, because Paul refers in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, chapter 3, 1 Corinthians 15, James does it in James chapter 3. You have a person here who is in a biological body of human flesh. Before he is converted to Christ, he is a psychikos. When he is converted to Christ, he is a pneumatikos. Now, wait a minute. You're talking the same flesh and blood and bone and sinew and all this kind of stuff. Same identical, quote, human being, if you want to use that term. But their status, their mode of living has totally changed. So, like I said, I was blown away as I read Steve Gregg's comment on psychikos and pneumatikos. Well, guess what? In his book on the resurrection, Sam Frost wrote, now he claims he's rejected all of that. It's sad to see good scholarship rejected, but nonetheless, Sam Frost pointed all of this out. He did linguistic studies showing pneumatikos, psychikos. It's not a tissue issue. It's like not a tissue issue.
I'm stealing that.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's what's so important, ladies and gentlemen. When you hear somebody like Sam Frost and Jeremiah, who, you know, chimed right in, not as strongly, I'm glad to say, but when they point the finger at preterists, oh, they're Gnostics, then perhaps they ought to realize that there's a huge burden of proof that lies on them to take the language of Paul. You are not in the flesh. He's writing to, I'm assuming he's writing to living, breathing human beings, right? You are not in the flesh. Now, perhaps Mr. Frost can create a blog and explain to us how Paul could say to living, breathing human beings, you are not in the flesh, or he could say, if you're in the flesh, you cannot be pleasing to God, and that not be Gnostic, according to his definition of things, as he points the finger at us.
Right.
It will be interesting to see if Mr. Frost will take up the challenge, number one, of truly, properly defining Gnosticism. And secondly, explaining how Paul was not a Gnostic because of the language that he used, which some scholars, remember, 19th century, Paul's a Gnostic. But again, in more modern terms, R.T. France now recognizes, yeah, Paul wasn't using that language like we do today. N.T. Wright understands Paul's not using flesh of biology. He understands it's not a tissue issue. So, yeah. And that is where it gets into something that's really disturbing to me is Mr. Frost made so many of these accusations just flippantly, as if they're not, as if the accusations are not even questionable, as if they are true beyond any doubt. But I sat there and I listen. I know you did as well, and other people did as well. And they sit and listen to these accusations, and they're going, "Whoa, this is absolutely not correct." So maybe it's time for Mr. Frost. Maybe Jeremiah will will take up the challenge. Lower the heat. Stop calling names. And of course, he called us heretics. He said we're not Christians. And, other adjectives that he used.
Don, it's because people in his church are asking him questions about preterism that he can't answer. And
good point.
And like I told you, here's a kid, Jeremiah, who had a debate with two Catholics. In that debate, he said that the book of Revelation was written before AD 70. He will not answer any of my questions related to that. When it comes to time texts, Revelation 11 as it is connected to Daniel 12, the resurrection and the judgment of the dead is going to be when Jerusalem is trodden down by the Gentiles in that 3.5-year period of war. He can't answer these questions, so he's bringing in Sam, hoping that Sam will do his work for him. And so far, all they've done is kind of patted each other on the back and talked philosophy. That's pretty much what I've seen. And name calling. That's pretty much the extent of it.
Okay, well, let's move on, because Sam appealed to a couple of texts, and he even, particularly one of them, I think it was at the, was it at the 1 minute 15 mark or 1 hour 15 mark? I didn't delineate that, but it was Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11. And folks, if you have your Bible, we hope that you'll get it. I hope you'll kind of follow along. But Sam Frost made a really big point on Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11. Now, I'm going to turn this over to Mike here momentarily. He made a big point of saying, I have looked and I have looked and I have looked at scholarship from down through the centuries. I have not found one person that disagreed with what I'm about to say. And what I'm about to say is Ecclesiastes chapter 3, that God knows the beginning from the end from the beginning. And all the scholars, nobody disagrees. And he said, I've looked and I've looked and I've looked, and I could not find a single one that disagreed. This is the beginning of time, the end of time. So, Mike, you shared with me something off air about Sam's long, arduous, comprehensive search for someone that took a different rendering of Ecclesiastes 3:11.
Yes, he searched scholars, German scholars, Latin scholars, any kind of journal, any kind of commentary, anything that would prove that this passage is teaching anything other than the end of world history.
Yeah.
Well, in my devotional reading in my yearly Bible program, the next day, August 27th, it said read Ecclesiastes 3. So I'm like, okay, Lord, you want me to get into this? Great. Providence has it. So it took me 2 minutes, Don. 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Didn't agonize. Didn't.
No, wait a minute. Did you look at any German scholars or Latin?
No. Didn't even get to that step in my hermeneutic or expositional process, right? I just went to the translations. Ecclesiastes 3:11 and 12 in the ERT Bible states this: God has made everything fit beautifully in its appropriate time, but he has also placed ignorance in the human heart. And again, that Hebrew word can be ignorance, can be darkness, can be world, can be eternity. All right. Here it's ignorance in the human heart, so that people cannot discover what God has ordained from the beginning to the end of their lives.
Oh, wait.
I have concluded that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to enjoy themselves as long as they live. And before that, there's a time to be born and there's a time to die.
Exactly.
This is referring to the end of one's life. It's got nothing to do with the end of world history. And that's how I read the text initially. I'm like, yes. That was my first instinct. And then I'm like, I wonder if anyone agrees. Yeah. And, I was kind of intimidated by what Sam had said. I wasn't going to find anything. And here was this translation that pretty much gives the same meaning that I gave it. But
when I heard Sam make the claim that he had looked at all the German scholarship and the Latin and, the early writings and blah, 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 and he just hadn't found a single one in all this massive search that disagreed with the view that it was the beginning of time and the end of time. I thought to myself, well, I've had a view of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now, I want to admit I had never spent hours upon hours poring over the text. I've read it a million times, but I'd never spent a lot of exegetical time on the text. But what I had concluded years and years and years and years before I ever became a preterist, okay, before I ever even knew what the term a preterist was, the keynote introductory thought, there's nothing new under the sun. So just like you had come to the same basic conclusion, and then you found the translations. I must confess, I had never even gone to the translations before and looked at them to determine, well, okay, what is this? So that raises a question. It is a question of presupposition. It is a question of a priori, quote, exegesis. And it's, in that case, it's not exegesis, it is eisegesis.
Don, could we use the word shoehorn? Do you think Sam is guilty of shoehorning every text he can find as far away from preterism as he possibly can?
Well, I think that's only fair. That's certainly what they accuse us of doing.
Right.
They accuse us of every single text we go to, no matter what it says, we shoehorn it into AD 70. Well, this is a classic example. It appears, and again, trying to be kind, but it appears that Sam has gone to a concordance and looked up the term beginning. He looked up the term end, and he found a phrase, from the beginning to the end. And he goes, see, beginning to end. He didn't even look at the context. He didn't look at the qualifying phrase that introduces the entire discussion of the entire chapter, which is, there's nothing new under the sun, or there is a time and a season, let's see, for everything under the sun.
Right.
From the beginning to the end of man's life under the sun.
Yeah, and our lives are the whole context of Ecclesiastes.
The physical life under the sun is the entire context.
Exactly.
It is not an eschatological text dealing with creation and Genesis and eschatology, i.e., the end in Revelation. So I was just struck of how strongly Sam appealed to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, insisting that this is such a powerful, definitive text to refute covenant eschatology. And again, I was sitting there looking back on my youth, in which, in devotional time perhaps, or personal study time, whatever it was, in my reading of the text, I didn't see any problem whatsoever saying, okay, that's talking about man under the sun, man living his life, beginning his life on the earth under the sun, man ending his life under the sun, and God knows. What's the problem here?
Right. Yeah.
So
I didn't see it. And
so that's troublesome to me. And maybe it's more than just a little bit revealing. Those of you who know me best, those of you who know my videos and my writings, know about my little Latin term, argumentum ad desperatum. It's not a Latin term. I invented the term, but I coined that term to describe the desperation of the opponents of covenant eschatology, that when they cannot go to the biblical text, engage in in-depth, solid exegesis, what do? Well, they find a term, a word, or a phrase, and they say, look, God knows the beginning and the end. Well, it must be the end of time. When the end of time has never been mentioned. And I'm not arguing from the absence of the term end of time. I'm not guilty of a negative fallacy here. I'm simply pointing out if you are going to read end of time into it, then show us the contextual justification. Show us where it goes beyond the things under the sun.
Well, Don, talking about shoehorning and the end of time, Revelation 10, 6 and 7. Sam is what does he become, a King James only guy, or what's going on here?
Makes you wonder.
The end of time, or there will be no more delay.
Right. I was somewhat staggered when he went over Revelation chapter 10, 7 and tried to make it say end of time. It would be really, really good if our viewers would avail themselves of G.K. Beale. Now, look, you have to understand, G.K. Beale is no friend of preterists. Okay? He won't debate me. I challenged him to his face in Oklahoma City to debate me, and he stood there kind of stunned and said, well, I will, I'll think about it. And I went up on stage afterwards. I stood up in the audience and challenged him. They had an open mic, and so I took advantage of it and challenged him. And he stood there kind of stunned. I went up on stage with him after everything was dismissed, and I said, Mr. Beale, I said, look, I respect you greatly. I love your books. I love your writings. But I said, you've made some really egregious charges against the preterist movement. And I said, I'd like to meet you in formal public debate to answer some of your charges. Well, Don, I'll seriously think about that.
Yeah.
No, he wouldn't.
Yeah.
But here's the point. Here's the point I was getting at. G.K. Beale is no friend of the preterists. G.K. Beale has one of the most extended discussions of Revelation chapter 10 and verse 7 that you'll find in any commentary, asking the question, was John predicting a time when there would be no more time? Was he saying no more time as in end of time? Well, let's just say he has some pretty strong words to say against those who claim that's what it's teaching.
And yet his theology would want that.
Exactly. It's exactly what I was getting ready to say. G.K. Beale wants an, quote, end of time, yet he knows linguistically. And let's make no mistake, G.K. Beale knows the Greek. And he knows that a whole lot better than Sam Frost. All due respect to Sam and the research he's done, doesn't matter. G.K. Beale is a world-class authority when it comes to the meaning of the Greek. G.K. Beale says you cannot support the idea of end of time in Revelation chapter 10 and verse 7. So here is G.K. Beale, again, who is no friend of the preterist movement, but who is approaching the text analytically, linguistically, grammatically, and he says, it doesn't mean end of time, period. End of story. But we have Sam Frost, whose entire ministry
is to find something that
or anything that he can bring a charge against preterists. In other words, he's prejudiced.
Absolutely.
Let's just face it. Sam Frost is prejudiced, highly prejudiced against the preterist movement.
Well, let me piggyback off of that since you brought up G.K. Beale. Sam said a couple things. He said the fall of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70 was on par with what happened on 9/11 and with the Twin Towers falling. Last I checked on, do we refer to the Twin Towers as heaven and earth? Because G.K. Beale points out in his book on the temple that the Jews referred to Jerusalem, the land of Israel, and the temple as heaven and earth.
Yeah.
So, of course, I got on the phone with him and he got a little upset on the John Anderson show. I said, well, if that's the case, then why in Matthew 24, verse 35, when Jesus says heaven and earth will pass away, but my words, I said, that's clearly, the temple and the old covenant system. And he just, you must be a preterist. I'm like, yeah, like your one of your co-authors who actually takes that as the temple. And Matthew 5, by the way. So that was weird. Also, Beale, since Sam is claiming to be an amillennialist and Beale is an amillennialist,
right?
We heard, Don, that the 1,000 years in Revelation 20 has to be a symbolic reference to a very, very long period of time.
Yeah.
Now, I have my commentary of Beale on Revelation handy. I'm sure it's here somewhere.
Yeah.
But in that commentary, Don, And
I'm familiar with.
I cite it in both of my books on the millennium issue. He says, nope, 1,000 years can be symbolic of a short period of time.
That's
And
correct.
he even documents Jews believing that the millennial period was 40 years.
Yes.
So,
well, and that gets back.
up.
See, that gets back to some of Sam's language that was, it seems, purposely intended to be offensive. He said it's just stupid.
Oh yeah.
To think that 1,000 could refer to 40 years or 37 years. And Jeremiah kind of chimed in on that. Well, that just doesn't make sense, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, our mutual friend, Robert Cruikshank, has done some marvelous, marvelous research on how the Hebrews used large, large, large numbers to speak about much smaller numbers, numerically, arithmetically, but with great significance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And boy, I tell you, Robert shared that information with me. He first of all contacted me. He said, Don, do you think I ought to pursue this study? He said, here's what I'm seeing, that the Hebrews used really big numbers to speak of smaller numbers, but to magnify the importance in the mind of the listener.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, you really, really, really need to develop that.
Yeah.
I said, that is totally awesome. And he has, oh my goodness gracious, it's good stuff. So when you have someone that is saying it's stupid, literally stupid, to say that 1,000 cannot represent a smaller number, I would simply say that's not a very scholarly view. That is a prejudicial view. Now, can large numbers represent large numbers? Well, who denies that? I don't know of any preterist that denies that.
Right.
That is not the issue. The issue is, what is the point of revelation? What is the point of the apocalypse in using these numbers? And so none of that seems to matter when ridicule can be brought to bear that says, oh, it's just stupid to think that 1,000 could refer to 37 or 40 or whatever. I really believe that is a major failure to properly honor Hebraic thought. And the more I study Hebraic thought, the more I'm convinced that so much of the error in our theological world today is the lack of, or the failure to understand and to assimilate Hebraic thought patterns into our world. And of course, there's some really good scholarly work out there in the religious world right now, reading reading the New Testament through Eastern eyes. Ken Bailey, absolutely fantastic book on the parables, illustrating how Jesus is telling the parables. If you don't understand the Aramaic and the Hebraic context of those parables, and I got to tell you, when I studied through Bailey's book and saw how he illustrated what he was saying from the Hebraic scriptures and from the Hebraic ancient cultures, I told my wife a couple of different times, I said, I am so embarrassed to have been so ignorant for so many years. It is absolutely awful that I have been so ignorant, thinking that I knew a little bit about the Bible. I mean, it's just staggering. So there's all sorts of books out there that have been and are being written right now to point out how important it is. And Richard Hayes, he hasn't written a monograph on this per se, but one of the things that Richard Hayes has written in his Conversion of the Imagination was, he pointed out one of the major problems with biblical interpretation. One of the major problems in the very earliest of the church was that the earliest church began to be inundated with Greeks who were Hellenistic. They had no concept of the Hebraic thought. They could read, obviously, the Greek. They even used Old Testament terms in the Greek, but they were not using those Old Testament terms when they used the Greek with the right Hebraic application.
Yeah. When you read the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew and in Aramaic, there's some serious translation issues that actually just makes the Bible come alive,
Yeah,
that solves some problems as well.
yeah,
So
I have an Aramaic version, translated from the Aramaic of Matthew, and well, you're right. So all of this said, you see, goes back to what is the point of making all of these accusations of name calling? It's just really sad. Okay, let's move on. Another one of the passages. I got to tell you, and we've been at this almost an hour already, Mike. And I knew we weren't going to get through all the material. So anyway, but I do want to get to this particular one because Sam and Jeremiah made a big point of an argument from infinity,
oh yeah.
and Jeremiah said over and over, if you're going to be a full preterist, you got to give up the doctrine of omniscience. And Sam made the point, the only way that God can know anything is if it has an end. He said at least twice, everything must have a telos. Everything
Yes.
must have an end.
Maybe a primer before we get
Okay.
to Ecclesiastes 1:4 in connection with the new heavens and new earth, 2 Peter 3 and Isaiah 65, would be Jeremiah's claim that we are redefining the end in the New Testament. Now, you debated Joel McDermott. Did Joel McDermott not take just about, not just in Jesus's teaching, but Paul's, did he not take the end of the age or the end everywhere as the end of the old covenant age? Doesn't Gary DeMar do that?
Yes.
Didn't Milton Terry do that?
Yes.
Are we really redefining this, or are we getting it from Reformed and Orthodox sources?
Well, it's just like you and I were talking about off the air earlier in the day. When it comes to 2 Peter chapter 3, to bring that up before we can get to it, but Sam Frost says it's just Gnostic to apply 2 Peter chapter 3 to AD 70. That's just pure Gnosticism.
Right.
Well, wait a minute. Here he is. Let's see. John Owen, John Gill, both of whom were building on John Lightfoot.
I don't know. Did John Gill take 2 Peter 3? I'm not sure about John Gill.
I'm almost positive
Really?
he did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Reformed
Baptist then.
Yeah, we'll have to double check that, but almost positive. So,
okay.
Now, that raises.
Well, I've got a let me go through the list real quick.
Yeah.
Jeff Durbin, who is Jeremiah's favorite apologist, takes 2 Peter 3 as AD 70. Owen, Lightfoot, R.C. Sproul, Doug Wilson, Peter Leithart, Gary DeMar, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Now, Jeremiah said these people are deluded to believe that we're in the new heavens and the new earth.
Correct.
We're some of the greatest scholars within the Reformed faith, both past and present. Are they deluded? Are they Gnostic or have Gnostic tendencies? Now Sam is calling these people, I don't know if you caught it, hyper partial preterists.
Hyper partial preterists. Yeah.
He's trying to redefine the terms. Yes. I don't know if you caught that.
Yes, I did. Well, okay. And to me, he's trying to establish himself as the authority for defining people's categories.
Right.
That's what it came across to me as.
Exactly.
And so here Sam Frost says, I know what a true preterist is, they're heretics. I know what a partial preterist is that takes the view of the following, blah, 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 and they're a hyper partial. How many different classifications is Sam going to come up with? And is he going to establish himself as the ultimate authority of defining all this?
Apparently. I mean, because R.C. Sproul defined in his book, which they mentioned but never got into.
Yeah, right.
I mean, he made the distinction between a partial and a full when it came to the resurrection.
Yeah.
He didn't make a distinction on the time statements. That's what Sam is trying to do. He's trying to say a partial preterist is anyone that just believes that the temple in Jerusalem was judged in AD 70. Yeah. I don't know if you caught that.
Now, I didn't
But when it
catch that
comes to
particular
all the
quote.
New Testament
Right.
time text, anyone that takes those as referring to AD 70, they're hyper partial preterist. I caught that and I was like, dude,
Okay.
I'm not letting you get away with that.
Yeah.
And by the way, is Gary DeMar and Ken Gentry, are they going to sign off on that definition?
Right. Well, and of course it raises up, and it gets back to the consistency. You know, they want to stand, quote, united against the preterist, and yet, as you and I both know, you take Jeff Durbin's camp, you take Kenneth Gentry's view, you take DeMar's view. There is such a strange admixture in that range of modern commentators that how are you going to stand in a quote united front when you got, as you well pointed out a moment ago, you got all these guys, well respected scholars, modern scholars in the Reform camp. Well, yeah, 2 Peter chapter 3, yeah, that's AD 70. Oh, by the way, Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66, that's AD 70. And you got Kenneth Gentry, who now comes along in his book, Navigating the Book of Revelation, and he comes to Revelation chapter 21 and 22, and he says, contrary to the really popular belief, Revelation chapter 21 and the arrival of new heaven and new earth is not talking about the end of time. That's talking about AD 70.
You know, it's interesting because when you read Gentry on why 2 Peter 3 is future, he says because it uses Genesis 1 and 2 language. And yet, Don, I don't know about you, but I've referred all of the things in Revelation 21 and 22 that are taken from Genesis are a lot more in number than the references in 2
Peter 3. Yeah. Exactly right.
And now another charge was made by Jeremiah and Sam. Well, if you take these passages as AD 70 and you spiritualize them, then you have to negate the physical creation in Genesis 1 and 2. I was against us has to be made against them.
Yeah, I was sitting there going, where's the logical connection here? I'm sorry. I didn't follow that point A, B, 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 B. What
right.
I was just literally kind of stunned at that. I tell you what, Mike, we've reached an hour here, slightly over, actually. We clearly haven't gotten to cover Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 4, which was an absolutely stunning comment by
even
Sam.
Jeremiah. Did you see Jeremiah? He was like,
"Ooh,
I don't think you saw that coming."
Yeah. It's like, Sam, do you really want to go down that road? Oh, okay. Let's move on here. So I tell you what, let's do. We will conclude this blog. We will schedule another at your convenience and mine, so that we can pick this up. I mean, after all, they did a 2.5-hour blog. Why can't we? Right. So we'll just do it in sections and allow people the time to absorb. But folks, I hope that we have given you enough to think about. Number one, on the issue of non-exegetical points. It's just simply not appropriate, certainly not Christian, and it's certainly not decorous, and it's certainly not accurate for Sam Frost to point the accusing finger at the preterist community and say they're a cult, they're cultist, or they're Gnostic. There's not one thing about, the preterist community and the preterist movement that matches what scholarship itself says about those two realities. Nothing. And so it's again, it's just simply wrong, and it needs to stop. That kind of rhetoric needs to stop. Now, I don't know that it will. I would hope that maybe Jeremiah will take up the banner and say, you know what, we don't want to go down that road. We want to deal with these. I mean, after all, we're believers. I did not hear him say, although he seemed to chime in and agree, I did not hear Jeremiah say preterists are not Christians. They're not saved. Didn't hear that. So let's see what happens on that front, right?
I think he said we're not believers.
Okay, all right. Maybe he did. Maybe I just simply missed that.
And he actually said, and for us to be logical, we have to say that they're not believers.
Right. Yeah, I do remember him saying that. So all of that said, we've touched enough on Ecclesiastes chapter 3 to show you. And again, folks, remember, this is one of Sam Frost's key passages. I mean, he went right straight there when they wanted to get into text. So he feels like Ecclesiastes chapter 3 of 11 is extremely powerful. But Mike and I have demonstrated to you, Sam just hadn't done his homework. I mean, hasn't done his research in the, in the commentators, hasn't done his research in the translations, and he certainly hasn't done his research in regard to the context of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And we've kind of gone in a lot of different directions, but we've covered a lot of territory, covered a lot of important issues on this first blog. So we will terminate it right here. I've enjoyed this thoroughly, Mike. It's great to work with you. We haven't done anything like this together, so it's been an awful lot of fun. And so, folks, I'm going to say good night, and the same to Mike. And we will reschedule. We'll schedule another blog in which we'll pick up, because we really, really, really want to deal with Ecclesiastes 1 verse 4 and some of the other issues that Sam Frost raised. All right. Thanks a lot. We appreciate it.
Take care, guys.